Was Luke really a traveling companion of Paul's? New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman argues that Luke really wasn't. In his book Forged, Ehrman says the author of Acts is simply claiming to be a traveling companion of Paul's, and therefore unusually well suited to give a true account of Paul's message and mission. But he almost certainly was not a companion of Paul's. On the one hand, he was writing long after Paul and his companions were dead. Scholars usually date Acts to around 85 CE or so, over 2 decades after Paul's death. On the other hand, he seems to be far too poorly informed about Paul's missionary activities to have been someone with first-hand knowledge. For someone who was writing long after Paul was dead, there are a ton of undesigned coincidences between Paul's letters and the book of Acts. As a reminder, an undesigned coincidence is a notable connection between 2 or more accounts or texts that doesn't seem to have been planned by the person or people giving the accounts. Despite their apparent independence, the items fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. This phenomenon of undesigned coincidences between Acts and the letters of Paul are best explained by the truth of the narrative in Acts, and that the author was very well informed of Paul's activities and knew plenty about his companions, contra Bart Ehrman. Keep in mind that these are only a small handful of examples, and they come from an older book called Horai Paulini, which is written by my favorite apologist, the GOAT himself, William Paley. Be sure to stay with me until the end, and I'll let you know how you can get a digital copy of this book for absolutely free. So let's go ahead and get started. The cluster of coincidences begins with 2 quotes from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 1:12 reads, "What I mean is this, one of you says, I follow Paul, another, I follow Apollos, another, I follow Cephas, another, I follow Christ." And then in 1 Corinthians 3:6 it reads, "I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God has been making it grow." Both of these verses suggest that Apollos had been in Corinth. The second verse also suggests that Paul had been to Corinth first. In Acts, we find out about Paul's travels in detail, as well as a few comments about Apollos' life that confirm these conclusions. Let's take a look. Acts tells us that after his first visit to Greece, Paul went from Corinth to Ephesus, where he left his friends Priscilla and Aquila. More about this couple in just a few minutes. Paul then returned to Judea, stopped in Jerusalem, and then headed up north into Asia Minor before eventually making his way back to Ephesus. You can see this in Acts 18:19 and 23. It's during these later travels that Apollos comes onto the scene. Acts 18:26 tells us that he's taught in Ephesus by Priscilla and Aquila, and then went on from them over to Achaia. There he was, quote, great help to those who by grace had believed, because he squared off with some of the Jews in public debate over Jesus' messiahship. So Apollos seems to be one of the first apologists. Okay, that was a really lame pun. From this alone, we can reasonably infer that Apollos traveled to Corinth on this trip. However, we don't have to stop there because Paul traveled back from Corinth at the same time that Apollos went there, just as Acts 19:1 tells us. The verse starts off by saying, while Apollos was at Corinth. That's interesting and coincides quite nicely with 1 Corinthians. Now you might think, okay, neato, but so what? Hang on with me just for a second. There's more to this coincidence, which is just as indirect. This is between this passage about Apollos that we read about in Acts and a phrase Paul uses in 2 Corinthians 3:1-2, which reads, or do we need, like some people, letters of recommendation to you or from you? You yourselves are our letter, written on our hearts, known and read by everyone. Okay, so why exactly is Paul getting a little testy here? What's with this letters of recommendation business? Acts fills the details in for us. We read that after being instructed by Priscilla and Aquila, Apollos made his own journey to Corinth, and it reads, the brothers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples there to welcome him. That's Acts 18:27. So that's where Paul is getting this from. Apollos came carrying letters that he really was legit. As a wonder-working apostle who founded the Corinthian church, Paul sarcastically reminded them that he didn't need such a thing. But there's a whole lot more. Let's now move over to Paul's other friends, Priscilla and Aquila, which we've already mentioned, the couple that helped Apollos. Consider this passing reference in Romans 16:3-4. It reads, greet Priscilla and Aquila, my co-workers in Christ Jesus. They risked their lives for me. Not only I, but all the churches of the Gentiles are grateful to them. Well, that's really nice of Paul to say, but you might say, wow, Paul says hello to a couple, big whoop-de-doo. However, there's more to this greeting than meets the eye. For starters, the fact that this greeting shows up in a letter to the Roman church suggests that Priscilla and Aquila are from Rome. Now turn to Acts 18:2. There we read that Paul met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. So Priscilla and Aquila were originally living in Rome and probably only had recently come back once the expulsion under Claudius stopped being enforced. This is just one part of the coincidence. Paul also calls them co-workers in Christ Jesus. How did they get such a gold star from Paul? Again, going back to Acts 18, we find that Paul stayed with them in verse 3, and when he left, they went with him in verse 18. From this, we might safely assume that they were co-workers with him. However, only Paul's greeting in Romans makes this fact explicit. Furthermore, Paul says that they had risked their lives for his sake. Well, how exactly did they go about risking their necks? Go read Acts 18:12 through 17. There we find out that Paul is dragged out before a tribunal, and a Corinthian church member by the name of Sosthenes is beaten by an angry mob. If Aquila and Priscilla were Paul's fellow workers in Corinth, they obviously would have been exposed to similar dangers. Finally, Paul indicates that the churches of the Gentiles give thanks for them. Given the themes of the entire letter, this singling out of the Gentiles seems to have some extra sort of special meaning. And going back to Acts 18:2, we find that Aquila was a Jew who had been expelled from Rome. This was when the Emperor Claudius, sick of the riots in the Jewish quarter, decided to give all the Jews the boot. The Roman historian Suetonius tells us that this had something to do with a fellow named Chrestus. Most historians assume that the disturbances were due to the spread of Christianity in Rome. Yet Priscilla and Aquila were working with Paul, who in this very same city said that he was turning away from the Jews to focus on the Gentiles. You can see that in Acts 18:6. From then on, in verses 5 through 11, we see that Paul carried out a highly effective mission to them. Though they were Jews, Priscilla and Aquila were all in with Paul in the Gentile mission. So that's how they earned the gratitude of the Gentile churches. These multiple interlockings are so subtle and indirect, yet these details fit together, again, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Fictional stories and forgeries just don't look like this. But wait, there's even more going on here with Priscilla and Aquila. Let's take a look at another example in Acts 18. In verses 1 through 5, we read about Paul's arrival in Corinth. It reads, "After this, Paul then left Athens and went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker as they were, he stayed and worked with them. Every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah." So here we find out that Paul had worked as a tent maker with Priscilla and Aquila, and on the Sabbath he'd reason with the Jews in the synagogue. This is interesting in itself because Paul often wrote that he would work with his own hands to support himself in his epistles, but we never find out what exactly his trade was just from reading those letters. But when Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, apparently Paul quit making tents and was out preaching full time. So what exactly caused this sudden change? Luke doesn't tell us and may not have even known the reason. But when we turn over to 2 Corinthians 11, 7 through 9, we find out what happened. Paul writes, "Was it a sin for me to lower myself in order to elevate you by preaching the gospel of God to you free of charge? I robbed other churches by receiving support from them so as to serve you. And when I was with you and needed something, I was not a burden to anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied what I needed. I have kept myself from being a burden to you in any way and will continue to do so." So now he had the funds to give himself to the gospel full time thanks to some kindly patrons from Macedonia. And we also know which church sent him the gift from his letter to the Philippians. Just check out Philippians 4:15. Paul, in a very casual and subtle kind of way, corroborates yet another detail from Acts. Notice again how artless that the book of Acts interlocks with Paul's letters to the Corinthians and the Romans. Now let's take a look at a few more examples with Paul's friend Timothy. We know that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians from Ephesus because Paul sends greetings from the aforementioned Priscilla and Aquila in 1 Corinthians 16:19. Remember, we said that Paul met him in Corinth. That's again Acts 18:1, and that they went with Paul as far as to Ephesus. See Acts 18:26. Paul also says that he intends to stay in Ephesus until Pentecost. This is in 1 Corinthians 16:8. Corinth, the capital of Achaia, was on the other side of the Aegean Sea from Ephesus. Now, take a look at these two verses from 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 4:17 says, "For this reason I have sent to you Timothy." And in 1 Corinthians 16:10 we read, "When Timothy comes." From these two very incidental texts, it's clear that Timothy had been sent by the time of Paul's writing, but that Paul expected his letter to arrive before Timothy got to Corinth. Given that Ephesus is directly across the Aegean Sea from Achaia, where Corinth is, we'd presume Paul would have sent his letter directly by boat from Ephesus to Corinth. Therefore, we can infer that Timothy must have taken some indirect route to Corinth through Troas and Macedonia. And when we flip over to Acts 19:21 through 22, which concerns Paul's stay at Ephesus, we find out that is exactly what happened. We read there that Timothy did in fact take an indirect overland route to Corinth from Ephesus. But enough of all these travels. Let's talk about some details about Timothy himself. In 2 Timothy 1:5, Paul says, "I am reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now I am sure dwells in you as well." In 2 Timothy 3:15, we get even more details about Timothy's upbringing. It reads, "And how from a childhood you have been acquainted with the sacred writings, which will make you wise unto salvation through faith in Jesus Christ." So Timothy was steeped in the Jewish scriptures and in the faith. These details perfectly dovetail with what we read in Acts 16:1-3. It reads, "Paul came also to Derbe and to Lystra. A disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the brothers at Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek." So in Acts, we learn that Timothy's father was a Greek and apparently drew the line at circumcision, but his mother was a Jewish convert to Christianity. That's why he would have been familiar with the scriptures since he was a child. 2 Timothy mentions his grandmother, but not his father. Neither group of details seems to be at all in connection with the other. Let's finish up by looking at one more involving two more friends of Paul. In Acts 15:36-40 we read, "Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, 'Let us go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they're doing.' Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them, but Paul did not think it was wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord." Wow, so this was quite a tiff. So why was Barnabas so eager to bring Mark along even though Mark ditched them in Pamphylia? Luke doesn't give us a clue, but when we flip over to Colossians 4:10, we have our answer. It reads, "My fellow prisoner Aristarchus sends you greetings, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas." So in Colossians, Paul explains the reason for the fight between Paul and Barnabas over Mark. Obviously, Paul didn't add this reference to Mark being Barnabas' cousin so he could explain Acts, because in Colossians there's no indication of there ever being a falling out involving Mark. By the time Paul wrote to the Colossians, things seem to have been patched up. Nor is Luke in Acts adding his own narration of the conflict based on Colossians, because he makes no mention of Mark being Barnabas' cousin, a detail which would have been very natural to include. These are just a small amount of these undesigned coincidences that you can find in the book Horai Paulinai. I could definitely keep going. We just cannot shrug these things off as statistical noise, and I've just given you the tip of the iceberg here. Paley has dozens of examples of how Acts interlocks with Paul's letters in undesigned ways, and again, you can pick up a digital copy of this book for free in the Google Play Store. Just check out the link in the description, and you can read it pretty much on any device. It's public domain, so it's 100% legal and won't cost you a dime. These undesigned coincidences just can't be the result of Luke being very sneaky, copying from Paul's letters and cobbling a story together. In fact, critics say that Paul's letters and Acts often contradict each other, and in a future video, I'll show that this charge is way overblown, but it doesn't seem that Luke was at all dependent on Paul's letters. The examples that we've looked at here give us some solid evidence that the author of Acts was well-informed, habitually truthful, and close up to the facts. It also shows that Luke was very likely a traveling companion to the Apostle Paul. Bart Ehrman is just simply off base here.